The room smells of beeswax candles and something older, something that cannot be named. A low fire breathes in the hearth, throwing amber shadows across walls draped in black crepe. A woman kneels on the wooden floor beside a small bed, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately, smoothing the white collar of a boy's Sunday shirt. Her husband stands behind her, one hand resting on the bedpost, his jaw rigid, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the room. The boy in the bed does not move. He's 4 years old, and he's been gone since Tuesday morning. Across the room, a man the family has never met before today unfolds the legs of a large wooden camera with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times. He does not speak unnecessarily. He has learned not to. He adjusts a brass lens, checks the light coming through the parted velvet curtains, and waits. He is not an intruder in this grief. He has been sent for. He has been needed. What is about to happen inside this dim Victorian parlor in the winter of 1880 will be the only photograph this family will ever possess of their son. This is the story of why. To understand post-mortem photography, you must first understand the world that made it necessary. The 19th century was a world intimate with death in ways that are almost incomprehensible now. Across Britain, across America, across the whole of the industrialized world, death did not happen behind closed hospital doors or in distant sanitized rooms. It happened in the home. It happened in the parlor, in the bedroom, in the kitchen. It happened to children with devastating frequency, and it happened without warning. Cholera swept through crowded cities in waves so devastating that entire neighborhoods fell silent within weeks. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, moved slowly through families like a shadow, taking one member, then another over the course of years. Scarlet fever claimed children who had been laughing at breakfast. Typhoid moved through contaminated water supplies with no regard for wealth or status. Smallpox left its marks on the living and took the rest. In the mid-19th century, infant mortality rates in urban England hovered near 30%. 1 in 3 children born in London's poorest districts would not survive past the age of 5. The mathematics of grief in the Victorian era are staggering. The emotional weight of those numbers is almost beyond language. If you enjoy forgotten history and dark historical mysteries, subscribe for more untold stories from the past. Families buried children with a regularity that, in any other context, would be unthinkable. And yet they endured it, because they had no choice but to endure it. They wrapped their dead in mourning ritual the way they wrapped wounds, not to forget, but to survive the forgetting. Victorian mourning culture was elaborate, codified, and deeply serious. Widows wore black for years. Mourning jewelry was crafted from the hair of the deceased and worn close to the skin. Black-edged stationery was used for correspondence. Mirrors were covered. Clocks were stopped at the hour of death. These were not the behaviors of a society morbidly obsessed with death. They were the behaviors of a society that had learned, out of sheer necessity, how to hold grief with both hands and keep walking. Into this world came photography. When the daguerreotype was introduced to the public in 1839, it was met with astonishment bordering on disbelief. The ability to fix an image of a living face onto a silver plate, permanently, precisely, with a fidelity no painter could match, it seemed almost miraculous. And for the wealthy, it quickly became fashionable. Formal portraits were commissioned in studios. Families posed in their finest clothing before painted backdrops of pastoral scenes and classical columns. But portraits cost money. For the factory worker, the coal miner, the seamstress, the tenant farmer, A professional photograph was not a casual expense. It was, for many families, simply impossible. Life moved too fast and too hard. There was no money for vanity, no time carved out for sitting still before a camera. And so the years passed, and the children grew, and no image was ever made. Then the child became ill. And suddenly, with grief closing in from all sides, the family understood that if they didn't act now, in these last remaining hours, or in the hours just after, there would be nothing left. No image, no record. Nothing to hold when memory began its slow, inevitable retreat. The photographer was sent for. Leave a comment below if this Victorian tradition surprises you. The photographers who specialized in memorial portraiture occupied a strange and solemn place in 19th century society. They were craftsmen, and they were witnesses. They traveled through city streets and country lanes, carrying wooden cases, packed with glass plates, chemical baths, exposure equipment, and the particular kind of practiced composure required of someone who enters grief-filled rooms for a living. Some photographers advertised their services explicitly for post-mortem work. Others simply understood it as a natural extension of their trade. Many kept their rates deliberately modest for bereaved families, knowing that the image they produced might be the most important thing that family would ever own. They arrived quietly, assessed the available light with a professional eye, and began the careful work of arrangement. Because the body needed to be arranged. Early photographic processes required long exposure times, sometimes several seconds, sometimes longer. The deceased had to be positioned with great care to appear peaceful, lifelike, and composed. Photographers used hidden iron posing stands, the same stands used in formal portraiture for living subjects, to support the head and body in natural positions. Eyes were sometimes held open with small wire devices, or painted open on the finished print by retouchers working with a fine brush. Hair was combed. Cheeks were given color with careful application of pigment. Flowers, white roses, lilies, forget-me-nots were placed in small hands or arranged around a resting head. The goal was not deception. Everyone who looked at these photographs knew what they were looking at. The goal was dignity. The goal was peace. The goal was to return, at least in image, some fragment of the person as they had been in life. Tintypes replaced daguerreotypes as the century progressed, and cabinet cards followed. Larger, mounted prints that could be displayed on parlor mantels beside photographs of the living. The technology changed, but the purpose remained. Families placed post-mortem portraits in the same albums that held wedding photographs and birthday portraits. They were not hidden. They were not shameful. They were cherished. It is important to sit with that word. Cherished. A mother in rural Ohio in 1872 kept a tintype of her infant daughter in a small leather case she carried in her apron pocket for the rest of her life. A father in Glasgow framed the daguerreotype of his eldest son, dead at 17 from a factory accident, and placed it above the fireplace where it remained for 40 years. A grandmother in Virginia held a cabinet card photograph of her twin granddaughters, both taken by diphtheria within a week of each other, and looked at it every morning until the day she herself died. Like the video, if you enjoy historically accurate dark history documentaries. These were not disturbing objects to the people who owned them. They were the opposite of disturbing. They were consoling. They were proof. Proof that the person had existed, had been real, had been loved. In an age before the technology to preserve a voice or capture movement, a single still image was everything. It was the entire weight of a human life distilled into a rectangle of silver and paper. Victorian religious belief shaped the meaning of these photographs as much as sentiment did. The dominant Christianity of the era held firm to the resurrection of the body and the continuation of the soul. Death was a passage, not an ending. The body left behind was still sacred, still connected, in the theological imagination of the period, to the person who had inhabited it. To photograph the body with care and dignity was understood by many families as an act of reverence. It honored the physical vessel. It acknowledged the reality of the life that had passed through it. There was also a deep cultural belief in the power of remembrance itself. To remember was to keep alive in some essential way. To forget was to allow a second death, slower and quieter, but in many ways more final than the first. The photograph fought that second death. It fixed the face in time. It refused the erasure that years of grief could bring. Inside the parlors where these images were made, there was often profound silence, a ticking clock, the sound of horses on cobblestones outside, the low breath of a fire, a mother sitting very still in a chair beside the small bed, watching the photographer with her hands folded in her lap, a father standing with his hat against his chest, siblings pressed into doorways, uncertain, wide-eyed. Sometimes the family posed together with the deceased. Photographs survive today, showing a mother with her arms around a sleeping-looking infant, a tableau that only reveals itself on close examination. A father seated beside a young son, dressed in his finest jacket. Siblings arranged around a brother who sits too still and too straight. These were final family portraits, the last time this configuration of people would ever exist together in the same room. The photographer understood that. The family understood that. The image was made anyway, perhaps because of it. The photographers themselves left almost no record of what this work cost them inwardly. They were professionals. They did not write, or if they wrote, almost nothing survived. But the photographs they produced speak with extraordinary eloquence. The care visible in the positioning, in the lighting, in the choice of flowers and fabric. It is the care of people who understood the gravity of what they were doing. These were not careless images seized in haste. They were compositions. They were acts of craft performed in service of grief. Some families requested that the eyes be open. Others preferred the appearance of sleep. Some asked that a beloved toy or book be placed nearby. A small dog once sat at the foot of a bed in a photograph made in Philadelphia in 1889, its head resting on its paws, as though it too was holding vigil. Whether the dog understood what had happened is unknowable. That the photographer included it in the frame was a choice made in full awareness of what it meant. These photographs are still out there. They surface in estate sales, in antique markets, in the bottom drawers of old furniture purchased at auction. They appear in archives and museum collections, in digitized historical records, and private family albums passed down through generations. They are, almost without exception, deeply affecting to look at. Not because they are frightening. They are not on the whole frightening. They are affecting because they are so deeply, plainly human. You look at a Victorian post-mortem photograph, and you see a family standing at the absolute edge of what they can bear. You see the effort that has gone into this final act of care, the pressed clothing, the arranged hair, the flowers chosen with deliberate meaning. You see the exhaustion in a mother's face, and the rigid dignity in a father's posture, and the confusion in the eyes of a small sibling who does not yet fully understand what sleep this is. And you understand something about grief that transcends any century, the desire to hold on, the refusal to let the image dissolve, the need to say, this person was here, this person was real, this person was loved. There is a photograph, no name attached, no date, no location recorded, of a young woman lying on a narrow bed in a room full of winter light. She is perhaps 20 years old. Her hair has been carefully arranged across the pillow. Someone has placed a single white rose between her folded hands. The exposure is slightly long, and the edges of the image have begun to fade with time, the silver wearing thin, the paper softening at the corners. Who she was is lost. Who came to sit beside her in that room? Who sent for the photographer? Who chose the rose? All of it is lost. But the image remains. Fading, yes, but still there. Still holding, against every passage of time and every act of forgetting, the absolute fact of her face. The Victorians understood something we sometimes forget in easier times. That memory is not passive. It requires effort. It requires intention. It requires someone in the worst moment of their life to make a decision. We will not let this dissolve. We will hold this face in time. We will keep this. The photographer packed his wooden camera. The family sat in the quiet of the parlor. The clock on the mantel continued to count out its seconds into the cold air. The shutter opened. The light fell on the plate. And for one long, still moment, time itself was asked to stop. It did.